Now, was that they would essentially start using Ukraine. You see, remember the goal is to stop Russia delivering oil to Europe, and the goal is to advance US corporate interests. Well, what are those three big oil corporations? Shell is one of them. The other one is Chevron. The third one is ExxonMobil. Well, if you go do the research, those three companies swoop in this time into that region. Exxon, a little bit around that time, was building, they thought they would start delivering oil reserves from Crimea. And Putin came in there and shut that down. Exxon leaves. Shell was in the eastern region starting to do oil work, oil and gas in Donetsk. And that's where we have the anti-Nazi Ukrainians, which were pissed off with the new president that was put in. They left. And then Chevron claims they left also in 2014 to 2015 because they said they didn't get good tax treatment. The bottom line, when you put this together, and starting in 2014 till today, is a Ukrainian under the backing of NATO and the US have been shelling the eastern part of Ukraine. So they have a war. Remember, war is another vehicle that imperialism can use to get what it wants, to create enough chaos and destabilization. So since 2014, when the coup took place, to today, there's been this war between Ukraine and the eastern province taking place. But let me point this out. When you look at this, is really about big oil and big gas. And their idea was they would create infrastructure in Ukraine, Exxon, Shell, and you can look all these up. And then they would build a pipeline into Europe, leaving and basically screwing Russia big time. Well, when you look at this, Putin actually got wind of this. And when you look at all what took place, Putin in many ways won that battle. Exxon, Shell, and Chevron were gone. But the goal of US imperialism, through the vision of Condoleezza Rice, George Bush oil family, she worked at Chevron, was to help this oil cartel use Ukraine to pump gas out and then deliver that gas to Europe. Everyone following? Just want to make sure everyone's getting this. Everyone clear on this? Remember, look at the timing. 2013, 2014, they sign lease agreements. They go into Ukraine. They start a war so they can destabilize the region, make Ukraine dependent, the Ukrainian people, on NATO and US. That's what's been going on. Yes, gangs, Serena says. Exactly. So just look at the timing, 2013 to 2022. All right. So the goal has been to destabilize Europe and Russia so Europe becomes dependent on oil sources elsewhere, not Russian. Everyone following? All right. So you have an architect, a systems architect, Condoleezza Rice. This is why it's important. I encourage everyone to go to truthfreedomhealth.com. We'll come back to that. And you guys have to learn the science of systems so we can all start really seeing the truth so we can get to freedom and health. Okay. But this was all architected by the big oil companies. All right. So they wanted to use Ukraine, but Putin screwed them up on that. He actually won that. So what part of this destabilization was, they did not expect the people of eastern Ukraine in those regions to actually fight back as hard as they did. And remember, throughout this entire 8-year period, even the UN, even reasonable people are saying, hey, look, we don't want to have this war. This could escalate to a nuclear war. Hurt a lot of people. Why don't we just sign an agreement called the Minsk II agreement, which would have settled the conflict on the eastern part of Ukraine, made those people like a state of Ukraine, given them some rights, so they felt some sovereignty, and Russia would agree not to go into those regions, and Russia was willing to sign that. But the United States wanted war. United States and NATO wanted war. They wanted war. They didn't support the Minsk II agreement. They didn't really push it. So then the US-NATO alliance, pokes the bear by putting out there that Ukraine might join NATO. And this is what really pissed off Russia, all right? Because that means that they could do whatever they wanted in Ukraine for US-NATO interests. And if Russia hit Ukraine, that would be considered war against NATO. So that's where this is all coming from. Russia said no. Russia then started doing what they called their military operation, supporting those eastern provinces. And we get to where we are today. What happened now? Well, over the last week, what's happened is quite profound. And you remember, the United States and NATO have been squeezing Russia. First, it's been hard for Russia to maintain their pipelines because of supply chain issues, because they need parts which come from Europe. So that's why, and then they were blaming Russia, saying, oh, Russia doesn't want to deliver gas to Europe, which is so stupid because Russia makes so much billions from delivering that. Then what's happened recently was when that failed, what did they do? The United States, NATO alliance, and we don't know exactly who exactly did it, but they literally blow up Gazprom's, Russia's 2 pipelines. And to give you the facts about this, Douglas McGregor was a former advisor to the U.S. Defense Secretary in the administration of Trump. And he, in a recent podcast with Andrew Napolitano, said, quote, he said, you have to look at who are the state actors that have the capability to do this. And that means the UK's Royal Navy and the United States Navy. And I think he said it's pretty clear. McGregor said he also noted that the Poland's former foreign minister from 2014, Radoslaw Sikorski, said he thanked the United States for damaging the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. Okay. And, he said McGregor says the Russians did not do this. He said, and then he added Germany did not do this because it's extremely unlikely they did it. So you have a senior advisor in the Defense Department says it's ridiculous to think that, Russia blew up their own pipelines. Remember, Russia's making billions and billions of dollars. They need cash reserves. That's what Russia relies on. And this guy's saying that people who had the ability to do this would have been either the UK or the Soviet Union. We have to also understand that where the pipelines were blown up, the 2 pipelines were 70 miles away. One of the pipelines is in Sweden, underground, in their territory, navally or sea-wise, and in Denmark, which is part of NATO. Sweden wants to be part of NATO. Denmark is in NATO. So Russia can't even go to those regions to prove that they didn't do it because they're controlled, one by NATO ally Denmark and the other by Sweden. So that occurred on, guess what date? September 27th. Those 2 pipelines were blown up. That is the same day that the 4 provinces in eastern Ukraine were finishing up their voting to do referendums to leave Ukraine. Okay? And remember, that is the oil and gas rich regions in that area. So they don't want to be part of Ukraine. They voted to be part of Russia or part of their own independent republics, which the UN Charter allows them to do. And so look at the timing. So September 27th, the referendum occurs, and more than likely, one of the US NATO allies or US and NATO blew up Russia's pipeline. So now they just went right there and they did essentially something so flagrant that there's no way forward. I mean, there's only one way. It's irreversible now. Europe must depend on US and NATO. I'll repeat that. Europe can no longer depend on Russia because the pipeline's cut off. And this is very similar. Someone said that when, I just saw on a recent news channel that was sharing some of the similar stuff, that when, one of the invaders came to the North America, the Spaniards, they blew up all their ships because they wanted to tell their own soldiers, we're not going back to the old world. We're here to stay. So this was essentially, they blew up the pipelines to send a message to Europe, you will depend on us. Remember, that was Condoleezza Rice's 2013 architecture, to make Europe depend on US, NATO, US interests on their platform. And that's what they did. They chopped that pipeline, which was tens of billions of dollars that Russia invested, truly something terrorist. And now Europe must rely no longer on Russia, but someone else. And this is interesting. The day that they blew up that pipeline, the next day, guess what happens? The next day, within hours to days, I think within 24 hours, they bring up a new pipeline called the Baltic pipeline, okay? The Baltic pipeline is brought up immediately. And what was this Baltic pipeline? Well, the Baltic pipeline was a pipeline that was under construction on and off by Denmark, and it's called the Baltic pipeline that goes through Poland. And this pipeline has been in development, but they somehow got it ready right in time. So it almost feels like they had this other alternate solution, the Baltic pipeline. It was all ready. They chopped Gazprom, Russia's pipeline, and they bring the other one up. So now Europe is now dependent on this Baltic pipeline. And remember, the countries who created that Baltic pipeline are, guess who? They're NATO. They're in NATO. So basically, Denmark, Norway, US, NATO, essentially a US NATO country is the one that's now delivering gas through the Baltic pipeline. I mean, they chop Gazprom and the next day they bring up the Baltic pipeline. Okay? It just literally happens day in and day out. One, without missing a beat. All right? So that's what's gone on, right? So going back to systems analysis, Condoleezza Rice wants to make Europe depend on US NATO interests, and that's what they've done. They thought they were going to do it in 2014, right? By screwing over Putin and Exxon, Mobil, Shell, and Chevron literally building oil fields or gas fields right in Ukraine and pumping oil to Europe. Well, Putin cut that off. That didn't go so well. So now US oil interests went in and chopped Gazprom, and now they have the Baltic pipeline. Everyone getting this? So I hope people are understanding, as Clausewitz said, war is another means of politics, which means war is just another means of politics serving the interests, in this case, of the global oil elites. And the Ukrainian people, they don't give a damn about how many of the Ukrainian people die. If they have to do a nuclear exchange, sure, they'll do that. If it's necessary, they'll risk that, because the amount of billions or trillions that are at stake for US imperial oil interests to monopolize Europe, and even if Europe has to suffer or Germany, they don't give a damn. I hope this is becoming clear. But you have to understand this plan was set in place in 2013 by Condoleezza Rice, truly an evil intellectual. But she knows system science. She set a goal, they figured out and then they started doing the inputs to achieve their output. And you know what? They have gained a lot now. Russia had massive leverage on Europe because they were giving them oil. Well, today, because they literally blew up Russia's pipeline, and now they have the Baltic, Russia really has no control. Russia has lost its leverage. And this is why Putin's speech that I reviewed a few days ago is important, because what Putin is saying was that US imperialism treats every other place like a colony. They don't want any competitors. They treated, they've treated many, the West, he says, the Western elites, they treated India like a colony, Africa like a colony, South America like a colony. In fact, they treat the people in the United States, the working people, and they exploit them. And he's saying even within these countries, and he's right about this. But more importantly, what you're seeing here is that government and launders, or, its control through private corporations, or private corporations launder their control through government. It goes either way. And as many of you know, this is what we had found out in our own lawsuit, the first to figure out that government launders censorship through private companies. See, in the United States, again, to repeat, government and private companies behave like they're separate, but they actually have a revolving door of leadership. They're actually one. And that's what's going on here. The war here is being conducted on behalf of US oil gas interests, a la US and NATO, and Russia is a big 800-pound competitor that they have to get off the map. And whether it means a nuclear exchange, whether it means the Ukrainian people, hundreds of thousands of dying and migrating, they don't care. It's this much larger game of trillions of dollars, and Europe must become a vassal, a slave to US NATO oil interests. That's what this is about. And to make this even more clear, after Russia has taken over, annexed, if you want to use it from the Western elite model. But remember, these 4 provinces they had a referendum, 90% plus people voted to be part of Russia, and those are a lot of oil is there, gas is there, that these people wanted to be part of Russia. They're part of, but Russia has committed now in their speech. Putin said that we will protect this, even if it means nuclear exchange. And why is he saying this? Because you see, oil, gas, and minerals, Russia's rich in that. And it is the foundations of their economy. That's what they rely on for cash reserves, because then they use that to buy other goods. So if you cut off Russia's access to Europe, which is what was just done, you basically are screwing Russia big time. And that's what just took place. But this plan, ladies and gentlemen, was put in place by Condoleezza Rice starting in 2013 to serve her masters. So she uses us, the citizenry of the United States, sitting in a position of Secretary of State, to serve her masters at Chevron and their friends at ExxonMobil, etc. And they don't give a damn if people die if there's a nuclear exchange. That's what we're talking about, okay?